The pound for pound discussion in boxing may be the most subjective part of the sport. Hundreds of fighters across the world, across 17 weight divisions. It can sometimes be difficult to narrow it down to 10 fighters, so I've made it even more difficult and narrowed it down to 100 fighters. Each fighter will be judged on several different factors, a combination of their experience, their records, their competition, how good are their wins, how bad are their losses, how many world titles have they won, how many divisions have they fought in, how dominant are their performances, what's their potential. And at the end we'll get a rough idea of my opinion of the top 100 boxers in the world at the moment. Especially since we see so many stupid pound for pound lists going around, including this one from BoxRec. And also because I just hit 10,000 subscribers, I think a long 1 hour video is in order. In advance, I know this list is going to be a bit all over the place and I'm going to get people disagreeing with me at every point. It's most likely going to age terribly. Keep in mind at the end of the day this is just my opinion. Make sure you like the video and leave a comment for the algorithm. The 100th best boxer in the world at the moment, as of May 2025, is Chris Eubank Jr. I think 100 is roughly where you'd put Chris Eubank Jr. He is world level, but not quite championship material. Despite being 35, he's not won a world title, but he has mixed it with champion level opponents. Billy Joe Saunders went on to become a future champion. George Groves was the super middleweight champion at the time of the fight. Liam Smith is a former champion. I will say regarding Chris Eubank Jr., I think compared to his potential, he has underachieved in his career. I think he is a very, very naturally gifted boxer. His jab is quick and sharp, he's got great head movement, good power in his hands, and he's a really impressive athlete. But it may be telling that the greatest achievement in Eubank's career was a couple of weeks ago when he beat Conor Benn, a career welterweight, and a fighter that's never really been regarded as a high-level prospect. I think the greatest compliment I can give to Eubank Jr. would be his heart and his courage, which was on full display versus Conor Benn. A lot of famous boxers' sons, because they tend to be given everything on their way up, they sometimes don't have the ability to fight fire with fire. Chris Eubank Jr. absolutely has that, and he's a real boxer through and through. Keeping in mind being the 100th best boxer in the world is not an insult. Thousands of people try and fail to reach this level, and every boxer in this list, whether you like them, whether you dislike them, deserves their credit. Which is going to take us to boxer number 99, Xander Zayas. Zayas has been one of the most hyped prospects at 154 for a while. Zayas has all the signs of a well-schooled, improving young boxer. He seems to approach fights with intelligence. His defense used to be a bit of an issue as he was coming up, but he's worked on that, he's catching and countering very well, and I think he's got a great future in the division. However, I don't see quite as much potential in Zayas as I do with other boxers on this list, because there are boxers in this list who aren't quite real contenders yet. I do want to give a brief mention to some boxers who are destined to be on this list someday. Dmitry Azanov, Hayato Sutsumi, Muslim Gadzhimagomedov, and Kermel Moton. And 98th best boxer in the world is going to go to Anthony Joshua. Now, this may be way too low or even too high for some people, depending on your opinion of Joshua. I will say Joshua does get too much discredit from fans compared to how good he actually is as a boxer. Joshua was at one point the unified heavyweight champion of the world, and the narrative just before the Dubois fight was that Joshua was in very good form. However, the reason Joshua is so low on this list is not only because of how good the other boxers on this list are, but also because of how inconsistent Joshua can be. I'm expecting Joshua, after this fight with Dubois, to be in the worst form of his career. He's getting older, his chin's taken a lot of damage, and since the Dubois fight he's dealt with injuries. Joshua, when he's on form, is much higher on this list, but we need to see it to believe it. We've seen so many different versions of Joshua throughout the years. Aggressive puncher, young contender Joshua, champion Joshua, overly cautious Ruiz rematch Joshua, boxer puncher Joshua versus Pulev. His best performance in my opinion versus Usyk in the rematch. Then his worst form versus Franklin and Helenius. Suddenly looks really good versus Wallin and Ngannou. Then gets eaten start to finish by Daniel Dubois. I can't imagine he'll take a punch the same after the Dubois fight, so that's why he's down there. Although I would still pick him versus someone like Filip Hrgovic or Martin Bakole. The number 97th best fighter in the world is going to go to Aaron McKenna. McKenna had a really good performance a few weeks ago versus Liam Smith. It's surprisingly rare to see a boxer who actually utilises their reach and height advantage. We'll get to fighters like Sebastian Fundora, Hamza Shiraz and Rafael Espinoza in a minute. Aaron McKenna is very good with his straight punches, and more importantly, he's very comfortable when he's at close range. However, I can see him really struggling to put a dent in the stronger middleweights, especially when he eventually moves up to 168. But for now, he's got a great future ahead of him, and I think he's way above the British middleweight level, which is going to take us to number 96, William Zepeda. I was actually very high on William Zepeda once upon a time. Regardless of what you may think of Zepeda in terms of his quality as a boxer, you do have to give him credit for being quite literally the highest volume puncher in boxing. But I'm not sure if he's actually champion level. I don't think either of the Tevin Farmer fights were robberies at all. And Tevin Farmer is a very, very difficult boxer to deal with, very slippery. I thought Zepeda won those fights quite clearly. But there is a big gap in that division between a guy like Tevin Farmer and a guy like Tank Davis, or Shakur Stevenson, or Keyshawn Davis, or even Andy Cruz. If his opponent isn't overwhelmed by his pressure, it can easily become a competitive fight, which is what puts him in this position. Another undefeated up-and-comer at spot number 95 is Pat McCormack. McCormack was an amateur standout, won a silver medal at the Olympics, losing in the final to one of the best Cuban amateurs of the past 20 years, Roniel Iglesias. To me, as a prospect, Pat McCormack simply has it all. Razor-sharp reflexes, punching power, head movement, defense, accuracy. He's an extremely calculated boxer. He put on an absolutely flawless performance over Robbie Davis Jr. last time out, and I can see him beating a lot of people in the welterweight division. I will say sometimes he's a bit too calculated for his own good. He does wait quite a long time in between punches, which may put him below some prospects on this list. But either way, he's definitely one to look out for. Moving on to yet another undefeated British prospect, Sam Noakes. To me, when I'm looking out for a prospect, what tends to catch my eye is someone who's a strong, powerful pressure boxer who can actually really box and not just brawl. One of those boxers would be Sam Noakes. For a lightweight, he's absolutely packed with muscle, and he does have somewhat slow hands, but he's extremely good at cutting off the ring. Sam Noakes has, in my opinion, the three most important things to being a successful pressure boxer: cutting off the ring, body work, and breaking the clinch. Sam Noakes is very good at all three of those things, and he's someone that's really caught my eye on these TNT sports shows over in the UK. The UK does produce some overhyped prospects, guys like Gary Cully, Pat Brown, Josh Kelly, but I really don't think Pat McCormack or Sam Noakes are one of those. Moving on to number 93, we have Andy Cruz. Andy Cruz is one of the best, if not the best, of his generation of amateurs. A lot of Cubans tend to struggle to make their style fit the professional game, but because of how good Andy Cruz is, and because he's turned pro not too late, he's grown into becoming a really impressive professional. Unlike a lot of Cubans, Cruz is capable of not just being slick and negative. Cruz is also very good offensively at the same time. He can work very well as an aggressive counterpuncher. He's got lightning fast hands, lightning fast feet. One thing that does put him down a bit though is his durability and his vulnerability sometimes. He does go through minutes in a fight where he looks world level, potential champion, but then sometimes he gets caught backing up to the ropes and doesn't react as well as he should. That suggests vulnerability. That's why Cruz is only at 92, despite how unbelievably talented he is. Moving on to 91, where we have Jinjiro Shigeoka. Jinjiro and Yude Shigeoka were both seen as the future of the minimum weight division at one point, and it wasn't too long ago either. They were both champions in 2024, and they both lost their belts in 2024. I still see Jinjiro as extremely talented, but he ran into an absolute nightmare in Pedro Taduran, who's a handful for any minimum weight on the planet. His eye was swelling shut and he couldn't handle the pressure. But regardless, the Valadares performance still exists. He's a very sharp, accurate puncher, and I would not be surprised if he had a Taraji-esque comeback, the same way Taraji evolved after being knocked out early on by Yabuki, which is going to take us to number 91, Francisco Rodriguez Jr. I made a list a while ago about the top 5 most underrated fighters in boxing. I put Rodriguez on that list at number 4, and I think that placement still rings true. Rodriguez is a former flyweight champion, and he's one of those Mexicans who make it competitive to everyone he fights, regardless of the competition. He fought a prime Donny Nietes, who was a top 10 pound for pound at the time, and made it competitive. He fought 4-division champion Kazuto Ioka, and arguably beat him. The only time he took a real convincing loss was 12 years ago versus prime Chocolatito. To this day, he's still the man who gave Junto Nakatani his hardest fight, and while Rodriguez may not have the quality wins on his record as other guys on this list have, him getting that decision in Japan over Kazuto Ioka may have turned his career around, and it is a shame that he's missed out on that. He's set to face Galal Yafai in a few months, and he's got a really good chance of beating him. Which takes us to number 90, Robeisy Ramirez. Robeisy is one of the best amateurs the professional game has at the moment. He famously won the final in the 2016 Olympics versus Shakur Stevenson. He did struggle to make his transition to the pros. He lost his debut fight, but he adapted, won the rematch, and eventually won the belt, and went on a really good streak beforehand, knocking out Abraham Nova and beating Isaac Dogbo for the vacant title. However, all of his momentum was cut short by an absolute monster called Rafael Espinoza. But he did almost finish Espinoza in that first fight, and I believe he's still championship material. Which is going to take us to number 89, Abdullah Mason. Abdullah Mason is a lot of people's most highly regarded prospect. and if you've seen him fight, it's clear to see why. For such a young fighter, Mason has made a lot of progression in such a short space of time. Superhuman accuracy, reflexes. However, I do have concerns that he struggles to stay disciplined during fights. With all his talents, he does let his defense slip sometimes, and that does hold him back in some ways. But that is very fixable, and I think he can be a future pound for pound at some point. Taking us to another prospect and recently turned contender, Rohan Polanco. I'm a massive fan of Polanco and his fighting style. I love the whole aggressive catch and counter style he's got going on. He stands right in front of his opponents and they still struggle to land clean on him. That style is also very versatile at the same time, which is a bright sign for his future. We've seen some boxers try to bring the fight to him and they've failed miserably. We've seen people try to outbox him at distance and they've also failed miserably. He's simply too good in the pocket and too good at cutting off the ring, which is why he's my second highest rated prospect in boxing. Which is going to take us to Robson Conceição. Similar to Rodriguez Jr., Conceição is simply impossible to have an easy time with. I think he should have beaten Oscar Valdez, who was the reigning champion at the time. He went to a draw with 3-division champion Emmanuel Navarrete, gave Shakur his most competitive fight to date, and took on current champion O'Shaquie Foster twice. I think Conceição did lose that first one, but could have won the second one. He's a very, very tricky fighter, and that's why he's up there. Which takes us to number 86, Andy Hiroka. Andy Hiroka is one of the most promising young contenders at super lightweight. There's a lot of really promising young fighters at super lightweight, guys like Adam Azim and Biasalonov. But Andy Hiroka has a great combination of having excellent footwork, fast feet, and also stinging power at the same time. His combination of footwork and counter-punching led him to stop Jin Sasaki in the first loss of his career, as well as Ismael Barroso. Hiroka is extremely talented and he's ready for titles, which is going to take us to another fighter who is Tim Tszyu. Tim Tszyu's stock has dropped massively after his loss versus Bakram Murtazaliev. Tim Tszyu is still really good. I think there's just a style that works against him. Someone who's stronger and bigger than him simply throws his plans out the window. But when he's got the ability to push someone back, he's in his element. So I can still see him beating a guy like Israel Madrimov. But guys like Bochuk and Ortiz and obviously Murtazaliev are a bit too much. I think he will beat Sebastian Fundora in the rematch, which is going to take us to light heavyweight where we have Callum Smith. Callum Smith's in a weird position where British people seem to think he's better than he is and non-British people think he's worse than he is. In reality, he's in the middle. He will always be a step behind the elites in the divisions he fights in. But he's a very, very capable boxer, tall, rangy, uses his range well. Great counterpuncher, power in his hands. He's had the misfortune to face a prime Canelo Alvarez and Artur Beterbiev, who's a monster. But that shouldn't take too much away from him. He's a top 5 fighter at light heavyweight. I'd be very interested to see how he fares versus David Morrell, which is going to take us to number 83, Chris Billam-Smith. CBS has sort of snuck his way onto this list. He's never really seemed to be that calibre of fighter, but he's got maybe the best chin in boxing, and he's simply a really hard worker. Combined with his strength and ability to adjust mid-fight, he is simply a very difficult cruiserweight to deal with, which takes us to number 82, Osleys Iglesias. Iglesias is simply the new version of David Morrell, an extremely athletic Cuban with knockout power. I do have a sneaky suspicion some of his early knockouts are a bit rigged, as in he'd hit someone on the glove and they'd go down and not get back up. But we have seen provably impressive skills out of Iglesias. Petro Ivanov is quite a difficult opponent to deal with, and Iglesias had an easy time. Iglesias' timing, punching technique and shot selection are very strange, but he seems to get by on his natural athleticism, timing and reflexes. He is a very difficult fighter to gauge because of his style. We do really need to see him fight in extended periods versus a live opponent. I think a great step up would be Jaime Munguia, and I think he'd take that one. Which is going to take us to number 81, Dalton Smith. I haven't always been too impressed with Dalton Smith, but watching more and more of his performances unfold, he is getting better and better. Dalton Smith is a counterpuncher, very sharp, great timing. I think his issue in the past has been his pacing, in terms of how low volume he can be. But he's been more and more active with his jab and counters and putting more heat in his punches. And because he's got really sharp one-punch counter power, I can see him beating a lot of guys in that division. I think if they gave him Subriel Matias, he'd find a way to win. And I do like his composure and how comfortable he is as a boxer. Which takes us to number 80, Jesus Ramos. Ramos to me is an elite champion level talent who's held back by one thing, hand speed. Ramos as a technical boxer has everything he needs. He's big for the division, he's got a long reach, he's great behind the jab, he's great at distance, he's got great body work, great shot selection. He was brutally robbed by Erickson Lubin 2 years ago, and I think skill-wise he's one of the best in the division. I can just imagine him with hand speed having snappy punches. I can see him beating everyone in that position, but He simply doesn't have that hand speed, which to me is the biggest thing holding Ramos back, which is going to take us to 79, Subriel Matias. I think Matias is both underhyped and overhyped at the same time. Before the Liam Parro loss, he was seen as some sort of boogeyman who was going to beat everyone. Now as soon as he loses to Liam Parro, he's no one. Again, Subriel Matias is the same boxer he was before. He was just given some selective matchmaking which made him look better than he is. Shojahan Ergashev is not that good of a win. He completely falls apart after 2 rounds. What puts Matias on this list though are wins like Batazandjuk and Bayev, or guys like Petros and Anyan, or Malik Hawkins, guys who are provably difficult to get a hold of. Matias is a guy who could simply outdog any boxer in the world. He's the most physically imposing and powerful 140-pounder, but he's very fundamentally flawed, especially footwork wise. There are a lot of guys he is capable of beating up. A guy like Jack Catterall or Devin Haney may simply not be as dangerous enough as they should be to get Matias off them, but you do have to lean the elites to beat Matias. Moving down to number 78, we have Sebastian Fundora. Fundora is a difficult one to place because on paper he's got wins over Erickson Lubin and Tim Tszyu, but he did get knocked out by Brian Mendoza and is very beatable overall. His defence is weak, and I do think Tim Tszyu is going to win the rematch because he won't be cut open in the second round. But at the same time, versus Tim Tszyu, we saw some improvements in Fundora. He's starting to use the jab a lot more than he was, and I think we saw his best performance last time out versus Chordale Booker. I know it's only Chordale Booker, but at the same time, what we saw from him in the fight was more impressive than we've seen previously. He's still the current unified champion. I think certain fighters like Crawford and Murtazaliev are certain to beat him, but if you're not on that level, I think you have to go through hell to beat Fundora, and that's what puts him on the list. Which is going to take us to number 77, Seiya Satsumi. If you've been paying attention to the Japanese cards recently, Seiya Satsumi is a must-see fighter. His fight versus Daigo Higa is the best fight of the year so far. His fight versus Kazuki Anaguchi was tragic but very good. He should have beaten Daigo Higa in both the first fight and the second fight. He beat Takuma Inoue recently, and I'm just impressed in general by his ability to punch and box at the same time. However, I do think he's the worst of the 4 champions at bantamweight, which does speak to the quality of that division. Yet another boxer fighting out of Japan, we have Anthony Olasquaga. Olasquaga is one of the most athletically gifted fighters in the lower divisions. He was thrust extremely early against the best fighter below 115 pounds against Kenshiro Taraji on short notice after only 5 professional fights. Since then he's shown great improvements. That performance versus Rico Kano was very impressive. However, I will say he was lucky to pull off the win over Hiroto Kiguchi. However, I think that loss was worse than it should have been because of poor fight IQ. I think with a better approach it would have been a clearer win, and he should be performing better later on, because I see him as the future in these divisions. Moving on to our number 75 spot, Galal Yafai. Galal Yafai can be a bit on and off with how impressive his performances are on the way up. However, last time out versus Sonny Edwards, he was in his comfort zone start to finish. That may be because it was a perfect matchup and Edwards is on his way out, but you can tell Yafai is such an overwhelming force. He does seem to fight on instinct a lot of the time, especially in the second half of fights, which may be a serious issue in his next fight versus Francisco Rodriguez Jr. But I can see Yafai simply toughing his way out of any situation he's in, because once Yafai gets going, he's very, very difficult to avoid. Which is going to take us further down to number 74, Luis Neri. Luis Neri has one of my favourite styles out of any current boxer. I know he is a dickhead and a steroid cheat, but the whole boxer-puncher-brawler hybrid style that he's got going on is very entertaining to watch, not to mention how dangerous he is with his hands. I think his 2 losses don't really speak to his quality as a fighter. Brandon Figueroa at that point in time in 122 was such a good fighter. I'm not really sure what happened in his last fight. And obviously Neri is the first to put Naoya Inoue on the canvas. If you actually look at Luis Neri's record, it's really underrated. 2 knockout wins over former top 10 pound for pound Shinsuke Yamanaka, Arthur Villanueva, Juan Carlos Payano, Aaron Alameda, Carlos Castro, Azat Hovhannisyan. Very recently he just knocked out Koyonosuke Kameda. I do rate Luis Neri and I think he can knock out a lot of guys at 122. Which is going to take us to number 73, Luis Alberto Lopez. Venado Lopez has maybe my favourite style in all of boxing. The way he fights is so ridiculous, I'm not sure how it works and how it remains so effective, but it does indeed work somehow. I would love to show footage in this situation, but Top Rank would not allow me. Lopez did take a pretty bad loss to Angelo Leo, who we will get to at some point, but his resume is still pretty good. Josh Warrington, Michael Conlon. I remember when he upset the prospects Gabriel Flores Jr. He's a great boxer and he's back in good form since in his last fight he got a knockout in the first round. Moving down to 72, we have Tenshin Nasukawa. I actually can't show any of Tenshin's fights, so I'm just going to show his kickboxing highlights. Tenshin is someone who I wasn't that high on early in his career. I didn't think he was translating that well to boxing, but that was only based on his first 2 fights once he fought Luis Robles Pacheco, followed by knocking out Jonathan Rodriguez in 3 rounds, then finally in his most recent fight to beating Jason Maloney, former champion. Watching Tenshin progress as a boxer has been great to watch, and the reason he's so high on this list despite only having 6 fights. If he can beat Jason Maloney after 6 fights, what can he do after a year or another year? The sky is the ceiling for Tenshin Nasukawa. His superhuman reflexes have definitely carried over from kickboxing, taking us to number 71, Jack Catterall. Catterall is boring but undeniably a very effective boxer. He shocked a lot of people when he almost and should have beaten Josh Taylor, who was undisputed at the time. He's got very slippery defence, a decent jab, a great left hand. The thing with Catterall though is that his boringness is actually a massive detriment to his game. I thought he easily could have beaten Arnold Barboza if he simply let his left hand go a bit more, but he didn't. He spent too much time waiting and staring at Barboza until he eventually lost the decision. I do see him as very talented, it's just a case of will he throw his hands enough to win a fight against another elite 140 pounder. Which is going to take us down to number 70, we have Fumulele Kafu. Kafu was thrown immediately into deep water facing Kosei Tanaka in Japan. Kafu was a big underdog and he managed to pull through. He is definitely losing to Jesse Rodriguez next fight, but Kafu is still young, he's a very tricky, rangy southpaw, and I can see a lot of potential in the future. Moving to number 69, Yoshiki Take. Take is very similar to Tenshin Nasukawa, a kickboxer who's only recently turned to boxing, who's now become a world champion. I thought his performance over Jason Maloney was slightly better than Tenshin's. It was his first ever 12-rounder, and as a result, he was slowing down in the second half. But through the first 9 rounds, Take was absolutely clearing Jason Maloney. And just like Tenshin, I can see him getting better and better as he fights. Moving to number 68, we have Ryan Garcia. Now, Ryan is one of the most controversial fighters in terms of where you can actually put him on a list like this. Obviously, the Rolly Romero loss does put him down massively. But to be honest, I really think that performance was a bit of an outlier. Regardless of what you may think of Ryan, some of his performances have been really good in the past. Look at the Javier Fortuna fight. He does look like a very good, talented boxer in some fights. Oscar Duarte has gone on to look really good since losing to Ryan. It's a bit subjective as to whether you'd even put Devin Haney as a win on his record. But regardless, we have seen a lot of potential and capability in Ryan. And for that reason, I'm still not going to write him off completely. He's still got the most dangerous left hook in boxing, and he's absolutely capable of landing it. Moving to number 67, we have Oshaki Foster. Foster isn't really special in any way. He's simply a very talented, capable and competent boxer, and he's got quite an underrated resume. He took the 0 away from 2-division champion Ray Vargas, beat Rocky Hernandez. Abraham Nova should have 2 wins over Robson Conceição. He's a hard worker and he deserves a spot on this list. Now to number 66, Pedro Taduran. I may be rating him too highly based on his 1 win over Jinjiro Shigeoka, but what I saw in that fight was such an overwhelming force. I can see him beating everyone outside of Collazo and Jerusalem in that division, and that includes Shigeoka in a rematch. Now to number 65, we have Christian Mbili. Mbili is one of the most entertaining fighters to watch in boxing at the moment, if not the most. He may be the closest thing we have to Mike Tyson right now. He's got a ridiculous amount of cardio for the amount of punches that he throws and the amount of heat that he puts into his punches, and for that reason alone he's a very difficult task to deal with. But he is quite vulnerable to a decent counterpuncher, as we saw in the last half versus Sergey Derevyanchenko and Carlos Gongora. Moving to number 64, Erislandy Lara. Erislandy Lara is ancient and somehow is still a champion in 2025. And he's also still very good. He's on a good streak of knockout wins, making Danny Garcia quit last time out. And to be honest, I can still see him beating a lot of guys. The Cuban style is quite suitable for longevity, which would explain why he's so successful in his old age. And I can see him beating a guy like Chris Eubank Jr. Now to number 63, we have Arnold Barboza Jr. Barboza to me is just a very well-rounded, competent boxer. He is somewhat average when you look at him, but he does everything right. He can move forwards, he can move backwards, he can box well, he's got a great jab. I do think the Teofimo Lopez fight was closer than people think it was. Barboza was landing the more effective shots in a lot of the rounds, but Teo won in one of the better performances of Teo's career. But I can see Barboza having the right game plan for a lot of opponents. Down to number 62, we have Seigo Yuri Akui. Akui has long been one of the most underrated boxers in those divisions. Since he won that decision over Artem Dalakian, he's a really educated and strong pressure boxer. He did lose his last fight versus Kenshiro Taraji, but I thought he really looks good in that fight, and I still see potential in him. Now to number 61, we have Caleb Plant. Plant is a boxer who I think could be better than he is. He's got extremely fast hands, great footwork, head movement, but a lot of work that he does in the ring is quite useless, a lot of shoe shining combinations that don't do any damage, and that definitely leads to him slowing down in fights. But even with those mistakes that he makes, he's a very, very good boxer. I think he's definitely going to beat Jamal Charlo later in the year, and I intend on putting money on that. Next up at number 60, we have Otabek Kolmatov. Now, this may be a bit of a weird one considering Kolmatov has not really achieved anything in his career. He fought for a vacant world title once versus Raymond Ford and got knocked out in round 12. But I thought he looked really good versus Raymond Ford and was up on the scorecards going into round 12. Ford being someone I rate extremely highly, and we're going to see him later on the list. Putting Kolmatov at 60 is more or less based on the eye test. I think he looks really, really good, and I think he gets less credit than he deserves. I can see him going on a bit of a comeback in the featherweight division. Moving on to number 59, we have Bruce Carrington. Carrington's in a similar situation to Kolmatov. He doesn't have the actual achievements to support him being this high on the list. But when I look at Shushu Carrington, I see a really, really talented fighter. Extremely good defense, great counters. His catch and counter game is some of the best work in boxing. I do think that Sullivan Sagawa fight was a bit too close for comfort, and it does show that that kind of rangy style is an issue for Carrington. But any pressure boxer on the planet, I think Carrington can beat in the featherweight division. Moving on to 58, we have David Morrell. Morrell, I see, is a very, very talented fighter who's going to get even better the more we see him. I thought he performed quite well for himself versus David Benavidez. That was a serious step up, and most talented boxers like David Morrell tend to improve upon that loss. I will say though, there were some bad signs from the Radivia Kalajic fight in terms of slick boxers being a stylistic issue, but anyone who's there to be hit versus Morrell, I think he can beat. And that includes Imam Khataev, who he's set to face next time out. Moving to number 57, we have Liam Parot. Liam Parot is quite similar in a lot of ways to David Morrell. They're both very skilled and dangerous counterpunchers, but when they fight slick boxers, they tend to have issues, which means I can see him beating almost every pressure fighter in that division, which already includes arguably the best pressure boxer in the division, Subriel Matias. Parot scored a massive upset over Matias back in 2023, and it was quite a convincing win. He was very thoroughly outboxing Matias for the most part, and he was dangerous enough with his hands to make Matias stay off him. He did lose last time out versus Richards and Hitchens, but I see Hitchens as very good, and we're going to see Hitchens later on the list. Down to number 56, we have Alexander Gvozdyk. Gvozdyk is severely underrated by people who only know him from the Benavidez and Beterbiev fights. Not only did he perform very well versus Benavidez and Beterbiev, Gvozdyk has been extremely good all the way back since his win over Adonis Stevenson. I see him as a more technically sound, less powerful Sergey Kovalev, and I'd put him at number 4 in that division. Now to number 55, we have Carlos Adames. Adames is one of those boxers who are very, very difficult to deal with. He's very strong for the division. He's got great shot selection, he switches stances, and he's quite a nightmare opponent for a lot of people. He surprised a lot of people by performing as good as he did versus Hamza Shiraz, and overall he's just a massive handful to deal with. Now to number 54, we have Israel Madrimov. I can see Madrimov being a boxer who everyone has an issue with. I thought Virgil Ortiz fought an absolutely perfect fight to beat Madrimov, and even then Ortiz had issues with the distance management, awkwardness and the footwork that Madrimov has. He gave Terence Crawford the hardest fight of his career. He put on a great performance over Magomed Kurbanov to win the title, and I don't see a single boxer who could have an easy time over Madrimov. Speaking of opponents who are difficult to deal with, who could be more difficult than our number 53 spot, Eduardo Sugar Nunes. Nunes is one of the most dangerous punchers in the sport, and definitely the biggest puncher at 130. Nunes has been tearing through opponents in the 130-pound division recently. The one loss on his career is a complete robbery back in 2018, but besides that, all 27 wins he has are by knockout. Similar to Christian and Billy, he throws so much into his punches and somehow doesn't slow down. And I think the scariest part about him is that he's getting better. Defensively, he looks better than ever in his most recent fight versus Miguel Mariaga. I can't put a fighter too high on this list without at least winning a world title, but I can really see Nunes being the best in that division. Moving on to number 52, we have Sergey Boachuk. Boachuk has come out of nowhere for a lot of people. He's basically the definition of an unstoppable force. Going into the fight versus Virgil Ortiz, I found it hard to see Boachuk eating that many punches without going down at least once, but he didn't. He went for 12 rounds, eating absolute bombs from Virgil, and never once stops coming forwards, throwing punches, and put Ortiz down 2 times in that fight. I thought he was going to beat Israel Madrimov when that fight was booked last year, and once again he's another one of those nightmare opponents. He's set to face Michael Fox this weekend, and he's going to demolish Michael Fox. Moving on to number 51, we have Moses Itauma. I am cheating a bit by putting a fighter who's so unproven this high on the list, but as we enter the second half of the top 100, pretty much everyone is either a champion, former champion, or has champion level wins. Moses Itauma I see as the best prospect in boxing. You simply don't see heavyweights move and punch the way he does. As of right now, Itauma is yet to lose a round in either his professional or amateur career. He turned professional at 18 after going undefeated as an amateur, and in the space of about 2 years he's found his way into the top 10 at heavyweight, most recently demolishing Dempsey McKean in 1 round. McKean being the same guy who went to round 12 with Filip Hrgovic, Hrgovic being the same guy who beat Zhilei Zhang and Joe Joyce. I think Itauma is destined to take over Usyk's position as king of heavyweights. I've never really been more convinced about a prospect. Now moving on to number 50, we have Sandor Martin. Martin was and still is one of the most underrated fighters in the sport. Martin is very slick, awkward, difficult to deal with, and dangerous offensively. He's very good behind the jab and great with counters. You can argue he should have won both of his most recent losses versus Teofimo Lopez and Alberto Puello. I think especially the Puello fight he should have won. If you imagine where Sandor Martin's career would be if he got the win over Teofimo Lopez, then defended over Alberto Puello and then won, he may be the consensus number 1 at 140. Now to number 49, we have Gary-Antoine Russell. I've never been too convinced about Gary-Antoine Russell. When he lost to Alberto Puello, I wasn't too surprised. But how good he looked versus El Rayo Valenzuela, I think really does need to be mentioned. He looked almost invincible in that fight. All the issues he had versus Alberto Puello, particularly in his entries, were sorted against El Rayo. He's really worked on his jab, and if he improves on this trajectory, he may be the best fighter in that division. Moving to number 58, we have Hamza Shiraz. I think Shiraz gets a bit too much flack for the Carlos Adames fight. Not only is Carlos Adames really good, Shiraz also had a broken hand in that fight, and it was visibly affecting him who was barely throwing his right hand. People forget how much of a force Shiraz looked as soon as he moved up to 160. I think he's got the most powerful jab in the sport, and considering that he's now moving up to 168 to face Edgar Berlanga, I think he's going to smoke Edgar Berlanga. I actually see it being an easy fight. I think Shiraz is going to stop Berlanga, and I can see people going back on the Shiraz train. Now moving down to number 47, we have Joseph Parker. Now, as impressive as Joseph Parker's comeback has been, I think it is a bit overrated. I think his 3 breakout wins do overstate how good he is a little bit. Deontay Wilder looks like he could barely throw a punch in that fight. The Zhilei Zhang win was good, but very, very boring. And keep in mind, we did see Filip Hrgovic do a very similar thing a while ago when it comes to beating Zhang. Ajit Kabayel did it better, and we're going to get to him in a bit. Martin McCauley showed up to face Parker on 3 days' notice with no training at all. And from what we've seen from McCauley versus F.A. Ajagba, that win's not too impressive as well. But regardless, Parker does deserve a spot on this list. He's very good. He's a very intelligent boxer and a rare kind of fighter in the heavyweight division, and he absolutely deserves his credit for fighting anyone at any time. Moving on to number 46, we have Melvin Jerusalem. Jerusalem may be the biggest puncher the minimum weight division has ever seen. He shut down the champion Masataka Taniguchi with a single punch, and since then has gone on to win the title and defend it against the same guy, Yude Shigeoka. Shigeoka being a very talented and impressive minimum weight. His sole defeat is to Oscar Collazo, and even then he gave Collazo a very tough fight in the first half. Filipino punchers like him in the lower divisions just seem to have superhuman power. Moving on to number 46, we have Ajit Kabayel. Kabayel has grown to be maybe my favourite heavyweight at the moment. The way he approaches fights for a heavyweight is so intelligent. I think I'll make a whole video about him the next time he books a fight. He's been in the shadows for quite a while in the heavyweight division since he beat Derek Chisora a long time ago. But the Riyadh season fights is where he's really shone. Unlike most heavyweights, he doesn't really rely on athleticism or power. He's the only boxer who I think matches Usyk on skill, although I do think Usyk would beat him being faster and more skilled. Starting with his upset win over Arslan Bekmambetov, then another upset over Frank Sanchez, then yet another upset over Zhilei Zhang. He approaches every fight with the perfect game plan and executes it to perfection. I've never seen someone stand in front of Zhilei Zhang the same way Kabayel did, and I think he deserves infinite credit for that. Next up at number 44, we have Stephen Fulton. Fulton's a weird one because on accomplishments and resume, he should maybe a bit higher. But I can't shake how chinny he looked versus Carlos Castro. I don't think Figueroa threw a single damaging punch in their entire rematch, so we can't really see if Fulton's chin has downgraded that much. You can argue top 20 for Fulton simply based on resume. Figueroa twice, Angelo Leo, Kegai, Roman, Castro. But I don't see him being that successful at 126, so he's only at 44. Moving to number 43, we have Fernando Martinez. Puma Martinez is the most entertaining boxer at 115. He throws with absolute venom, and he doesn't stop throwing either. However, I don't think he's quite as good as his last opponent, our number 42 spot, Kazuto Ioka. I actually gave Ioka both fights versus Martinez. I think for the first fight a draw is a fair score, but the second fight I think has to go to Ioka, especially considering Ioka scored a knockdown. Ioka is a very skilled boxer, maybe the best counterpuncher below 118 pounds. He's got quite a unique style in how immobile he is. He prefers to stay in quite a still position, focused on catching and countering. Some of his subtle parries, slips and rolls are very impressive to watch, and he was a 4 division champion for a reason. Moving on to number 41, we have Marlon Tapales. I see Tapales as a criminally underrated boxer. He's another one of those very tricky boxers to deal with. Both MJ Akhmadaliev and Naoya Inoue had a very difficult time trying to land clean on Tapales. I don't think anyone's given Inoue more defensive trouble than Tapales has. He's got a very difficult rhythm and footwork, and he's just as good as a puncher on the front foot. He's an extremely versatile boxer, is Tapales, and that's why he's at 41. Which is going to take us to number 40, Emmanuel Navarrete. Navarrete on paper could be higher on the list, being a 3 division champion, but Navarrete is such an inconsistent performer, I can't put him any higher. When he first moved up to 130, he almost lost to Liam Wilson, then had a career best performance over Oscar Valdez, then looks like absolute shit versus Denis Berinchik, then smokes Oscar Valdez in the rematch, his new best performance of his career, and now most recently I think was lucky to get a win over Charlie Suarez. That cut was caused by a punch, and they should have given it to Suarez. I haven't put Navarrete too low, but not too high either. I think 40 is safe. Now moving down to 38, we have Brian Norman Jr. Norman Jr. has been a bit up and down in his career so far. I didn't think he looks great initially, after performances like Boca Chica and Quinton Randall, but as soon as he takes a title fight versus a dangerous opponent like Giovanni Santillan, he looks absolutely spectacular, and eventually stops him, and continues that form versus Derek Cuevas. Norman Jr. being as young as he is, has a lot of potential, especially with his trajectory and the way he's improving. He's a very good counterpuncher on the back foot. Down to number 37, we have Bakram Murtazaliev. Murtazaliev is another one of those boxers who have came out of nowhere. There were not that many people giving him a chance versus Tim Tszyu, but he demolished Tim Tszyu, put him down 5 times in the space of 3 rounds. What makes Murtazaliev so good though is not just his power and the size he has for the division. He's also quite a good boxer mover. He's got a great jab and a great left hook, and he's got a very strong chin. I highly recommend checking out the fight versus Jack Kulke. Murtazaliev showed insane endurance in that fight, but it also highlighted how bad Murtazaliev's defense is. It's not as bad as Fundora's, for example, but it's not great either. There's a lot of people he can beat, guys like Boachuk, guys like Fundora, guys like Tim Tszyu in a rematch. But against the elites like Boots, Crawford, Ortiz, his defense may be too much of an issue. Moving to number 36, we have Alberto Puello. Now, while I do think Sandor Martin should have beaten him, his win over Gary Antoine Russell is very good, and Puello in general is just a really difficult fighter to deal with. He's very tall and long for the division. He's great on the inside, he's great behind the jab, he's got great endurance. He's set to face Subriel Matias next, and I get the feeling that Puello might beat him by decision. And if that does happen, we're looking at a record that contains Batar Akhmedov, Gary Antoine Russell, Sandor Martin and Subriel Matias. I think he would have the best resume at 140, besides maybe Teofimo, who we're going to get to later. Now to 35, we have Nick Ball. Nick Ball is one of the most consistently entertaining boxers at the moment. He is a brawler by trade, but he's a deceptively good technical boxer at the same time. Not only is he a challenging physical force to deal with, he's also got some of the best conditioning in the sport. He's always throwing these long-winded combinations of power punches and never slows down in the process. Even if his nose is broken and he's taken countless body shots, he will never slow down somehow. He's simply a force that will never stop coming. He's gathered quite a good resume for himself. Isaac Dogbo, Ray Vargas, Raymond Ford, Ronnie Rios, most recently TJ Downey. His defense, especially to the body though, does lack sometimes, and there are a couple featherweights I can see beating him, but for now I don't see him losing in the near future. Now to number 34, we have Richardson Hitchens. Hitchens is another boxer where, even though he's boring, I've learned to appreciate him for what he is and his skill. You can argue he's got one of the best jabs in boxing, maybe top 5. It's easy to give him stick for the Gustav Lemos fight, which to be fair, I think he lost. But Lemos is another one of those fighters I don't think gets the credit that he deserves. And considering the landscape of the division, because of his jab, I do think he's a bad matchup for Teofimo Lopez, for Jack Catterall, for Barboza Jr., for Subriel Matias, for Alberto Puello. His jab is such a difficult thing to get around, and that's why he's so high on the list. Now to 33, we have Anthony Kakashi. Kakashi is one of the most awkward fighters to deal with in boxing, from his footwork, shot selection, his constant changing of stances, not to mention how strong and tall he is for 130. He's been gathering a really good resume the past year. Joe Cordina, Josh Warrington, Lee Wood. Cordina being the reigning champion, the other two being former champions. He's not one of those boxers that stand out, but he's very difficult, and that's enough for me to put him at 33. Now to number 32, we have Carlos Canizales. Canizales may be too high for some people considering he's never actually won a world title. A draw versus reigning champion Ryoichi Taguchi when he was 23 years old. A razor close loss to Kenshiro Teraji in Japan. And most recently a blatant robbery versus Pradap Adabsri in Thailand. He should technically be a world champion right now. In terms of Canizales as a fighter, he's extremely strong for his division, serious heat in his punches. We saw an incredible display of body shots versus Daniel Matalon, who's a very, very skilled Cuban boxer. With all those reasons combined, I think 32 is a good spot for Canizales. Now to number 31, we have Masamichi Yabuki. Yabuki has been one of Japan's best boxers for such a long time, and he continues to put on really good performances. He's on great form at the moment, knocking out Sivanasi Nonshinga and then beating Angel Ayala. He may be the hardest puncher below 115. To this day, he's the only man to beat Kenshiro Teraji by knockout no less. Since then, he's been on a really good streak. Thanongsak Simtri, Ronald Chacon, Kevin Vivas, Nonshinga, Ayala. He's even got a close decision loss to Junto and Nakatani very early in both of their careers. I think he beats Okui, Alosquaga, Yafai, everyone else in that division except Teraji. Now to number 30, we have MJ Akhmadaliev. I think Mirajdon Akhmadaliev is firmly number 2 in the 122 division. I am aware that Marlon Tapales beat MJ Akhmadaliev, but Tapales is also pretty high on this list. It was a close fight, and I think MJ had a lot of ring rust in that fight. Since then, we've seen MJ in almost perfect form, as seen versus Kevin Gonzalez and Ricardo Espinoza. I do think MJ is Inoue's toughest fight at 122, and in general, he's just a very high quality fighter. Now to number 29, we have Raymond Ford. Ford is one of my personal favourites. Watching his career trajectory has been really impressive. He's been essentially thrown straight into the deep end in terms of the early fights he's taken in his career. There were a couple fights he should have lost in Aaron Perez and Edward Vasquez, but I think the Jesse Magdaleno fight showed real improvements. A bit of a turning point in his career, which led to him beating Otabek Kolmatov for the title and then defending versus Nick Ball immediately. I personally thought he should have beaten Nick Ball, and I think we've seen his best form in his 2 fights at 130. I believe Thomas Matisse has a CompuBox record for the least amount of punches landed in a 12-round fight. It was an absolutely perfect performance for Raymond Ford, and he's got a great future at 130. Moving to number 28, we have Angelo Leo. Leo is my second favourite of the champions at 126. For me, Angelo Leo is top 5 for fight IQ at the moment. Unlike a lot of fighters in the higher end of the list, Leo doesn't have much in the way of natural athleticism, but his toughness and the way he approaches fights is always spot on. I remember when Leo won me a good amount of money versus Venado Lopez as an underdog. I remember watching his fight versus Mike Planier, as you can see on screen. It's basically a textbook example of how to beat someone who's got a high guard with a dangerous left hook. He kept his right glove tucked at all times and made sure he was always circling away from Planier's lead hand. He made sure to invest to the body early to take away the power from the left hook, and as soon as Planier lost the initial explosiveness from the left hook, Leo was comfortable enough to start engaging on the inside with the body shots, and he was mauling Planier on the inside with body shots until he eventually found a left hook of his own to the liver. Not to mention the Luis Alberto Lopez fight. Lopez is one of the most unpredictable and explosive fighters in that division, and there was not a moment where Leo looked intimidated, and he eventually got another knockout with a left hook. Leo I see as the second best in that division, behind one person who is further on in the video. Now to number 27, we have Virgil Ortiz Jr. 27 is the highest I can put a fighter who's never actually won a world title. As much as his wins over Boachuk, Madrimov and Kavaliauskas could be world title wins, he's never actually held a belt, especially because of that period of inactivity. Regardless though, I really rate Virgil Ortiz Jr. I think for a high guard, power punching pressure fighter, he's such an intelligent boxer. He's got a really good jab, great footwork, arguably the best body shots in the sport. I love the way Virgil rips his hooks to the body. He's got a really sneaky way of finding the liver, and overall Ortiz is just a boxer everyone should be a fan of. Now to number 26, we have Ryosuke Nishida. I put Nishida at number 2 for my list of most underrated boxers in the world. That list was about 6 months ago, and it's still true now. Nishida is an extremely well-schooled boxer. He was thrown in the deep end very early. He took on a fighter with 21 wins and 3 losses in his 3rd ever fight, then took on Daigo Higa in his 4th fight in a 12-rounder, which he won convincingly. Higa then went on to challenge for the world title several times, Nishida, after only 9 pro fights, was given the title shot versus Emmanuel Rodriguez. I thought at the time Nishida was too green to fight a guy who's as good as Rodriguez, but Nishida pulled through to win the title, scoring 2 knockdowns in the process. Nishida is a really good counterpuncher, he's got great work at range, and he's set to face Junto Nakatani in June. Moving to number 25, we have Janibek Elimhanali. Janibek is yet another elite Kazakh middleweight. He's an extremely dangerous southpaw with great footwork. He's not been given a serious testing opponent so far in his career, but I thought his last opponent, Anuel Ngamisenge, could stylistically cause him issues, and Janibek knocks him out cold. Janibek is a great boxer with an equally great future ahead of him. We just need to see him against a fighter like Adames. Now to number 24, we have Zurdo Ramirez. Zurdo's a funny one because you don't look at him and think that's a really good boxer, but at the same time he is a 2-division champion with a very decent resume. He won the super middleweight title all the way back in 2016 versus Arthur Abraham, and his defences were pretty good at the time. Maxim Bursak, Jesse Hart, Habib Ahmed, Romer Alexis Angulo. Now at cruiserweight, he's got on the best run of his career versus Joe Smith Jr., Arsene Goulamirian and Chris Billum-Smith. Goulamirian was the champion for about 3.5 years before losing to Zurdo. Granted, he was fighting once a year, but still, it's a decent win. I do think Zurdo is food for Jai Opetaia. I also think he did alright for himself versus Bivol. He's a very good boxer, and I don't think he gets the credit he deserves sometimes. Moving to number 23, we have Daniel Dubois. Dubois is a funny one because he's entered this sort of second prime to his career. He was thrown straight into the deep end versus Joe Joyce, then once again versus Alexander Usyk. But he's definitely learned from the Usyk loss, but some issues he faced during and before the Usyk fight regarding his confidence. He's basically stopped reacting at all to punches, and he's developed stamina that doesn't seem to slow down. So he can take the adversity early on in a fight and then come through it, and we saw the proof of that versus Anthony Joshua. No one has really steamrolled Joshua the same way Daniel Dubois did. I think a younger version of Dubois may have spent too much time at mid-range and found himself getting picked apart at distance by Joshua, maybe going down eventually to a big straight right hand. I don't think he would have had the confidence he actually had in the fight, where he gave Joshua no space to breathe at all, and he kept putting Joshua down until the fight was over. This combination of confidence, endurance, cardio and power is an almost impossible task to deal with as a heavyweight, and for that reason, outside of Alexander Usyk in their rematch, I find it very hard to see Dubois losing. And even then, he may close the gap on Usyk in their rematch. No one is safe versus Dubois for 12 straight rounds, and that's what makes Dubois at 23. Moving down to 22, we have Lamont Roach. Roach is another fighter who seems to have blossomed after a loss. He took a loss quite early on to then reigning champion Jamel Herring, but then went back to the drawing board, started picking up wins, then eventually won the title versus Hector Luis Garcia. I was also very impressed with his fight prior to the Tank fight versus Fergal McCrory. He executed his game plan to perfection in that fight, and then obviously he takes on Tank, which is the fight that everyone's talking about. I thought Roach looked spectacular in that fight. His defence seemed so hard to get through, and I applaud both him and his coaches for having such a good plan to take on Tank. Roach did not force any aggression whatsoever versus Tank, and especially in the second half is better at distance, so he came very, very close to beating Tank in that fight, and I actually think he wins the rematch. Now down to number 21, we have Jaron Boots Ennis. I think there's quite a lot of people who have Boots a lot higher on this list. I've seen a couple people with Boots in their top 5. I do understand it from an eye test perspective, but if we refer to my resume audit videos, Ennis only has one A-tier win, and that's Stanionis. So I find it difficult to put him too high on a list like this, especially since the top 15 is all 2-division, 3-division unified undisputed champions. Regardless though, Boots is heads and shoulders above the 147 division. I think he will be undisputed if he gets the opportunity. I am a bit sceptical at 154, but anyone with eyes can see Boots is an extremely talented fighter. Now down to number 20, we have Vasily Lomachenko. Loma is a weird one because he is on the verge of retirement, but at the same time he did look really good versus George Kambosos, and he does have to sort of be here on merit because he's been top 10 pound for pound for about 10 years now. You can make a valid excuse for every loss Lomachenko has, especially the Salido and Haney fights. I think he lost fair and square to Teofimo. Either way, I think Loma just deserves to be this high on the list, despite his old age. He's got maybe the best amateur record of all time, 3-division champion. He's a genuine Hall of Famer. Now down to number 19, we have Tyson Fury. I remember a time where people were giving Tyson Fury the number 1 pound for pound spot. Granted, all those people were British, but still, I think it's gone underrated just how long Tyson Fury's been in the title picture. He dethroned Vladimir Klitschko all the way back 10 years ago, and he's still having competitive fights with a generational talent in Alexander Usyk. I will say the Francis Ngannou fight is quite a big stain on his record, but the fact that he looked so good versus Usyk afterwards is proof that Tyson Fury, when he's on, is a very, very good boxer. He is definitely on the slide though. I think if he maintained his physique from the Klitschko fight, combined with his offensive ability versus Usyk in the first fight, that could have been an unbeatable heavyweight. But for now, I think number 19 in the world is good enough for him. He may just be good enough still to beat Dubois and Caballel. I actually do think Dubois and Caballel both beat him at this point, but on merit, I think you have to put Fury above them. Now to number 18, we have Keyshawn Davis. You could argue this is recency bias because Keyshawn Davis has only just won his first ever world title 2 months ago. But to me, I think Keyshawn has more potential than any of the fighters at 135 or 140. We're going to get to those other guys in a bit, but Teofimo Lopez has shown bad ability to cut off the ring. Tank Davis spends too much time waiting in between punches. Devin Haney's defense isn't great. His power's not great either. Shakur Stevenson also has issues pulling the trigger. Keyshawn Davis, on the other hand, has no issues pulling the trigger. He's got power, he can cut off the ring, he's got defense, he can box. He's got basically everything you would want in a young boxer. The only thing he's missing is the wins to prove it, which is why he's below the guys I mentioned earlier. Moving on to number 17, we have Rafael Espinoza. I've talked about Espinoza quite a lot on this channel. I put him as my number 1 for most underrated fighters in boxing before the Robeisy fight. I stand by what I said in terms of Espinoza is the best fighter I've seen in terms of utilising his reach in an offensive way. Not only is he good behind the jab, he also utilises his reach and height on the inside effectively as well. We even saw in his last fight versus Edward Vasquez, Espinoza was using his angles, step back, pull counter. Outside of his defence, he's basically the perfect tall fighter. If he had the defence Tyson Fury has, I don't think anyone beats him, not in a way. No one at 126, no one at 130. Espinoza is also one of the most entertaining fighters in boxing. I'm a big fan, and he's at number 17. Now to number 16, we have David Benavidez. I think Benavidez is both overrated and underrated at the same time. Some people think he's some unbeatable boogeyman. Some people think he sucks, has no defense, has no footwork. If you actually look at his resume though, 3 of those wins are on this list. Caleb Plant, Alexander Gvozdyk and David Morrell, plus middleweight champion Demetrius Andrade. Those are 4 very good wins. I do think Benavidez has somewhat lost his effect at 175 when he doesn't have a natural size advantage. I know he had a tough fight versus Gvozdyk, but Gvozdyk is a very tough first fight in a new weight class. Morrell was a very risky fight that Benavidez did not need to take. Do I think he beats Beterbiev or Bivol? No, I don't. But do I think he's clearly number 3 at 175? Yes, I do. I also think he beats everyone who moves up from 168 to 175. He is a very good boxer and he goes at 16. Now we move on to the top 15 with Devin Haney. This is where the list gets a bit more controversial, especially since I'm going to start talking about guys like Haney, Tank and Teofimo Lopez, and discussion about those boxers seems to be the most immature in all of boxing. What I'm going to get with Devin Haney is why is Ryan Garcia all the way up at 68 when Devin Haney's at 15? And this is where the grey area comes in terms of whether we actually value the Ryan Garcia loss or not. For the sake of the video, I'm not really going to value it as a loss, but rather a demonstration of some weaknesses in Devin Haney's game. Because if we totally disregard the loss entirely, if Devin Haney was 32-0 and we look at the list on accomplishments and nothing else, Haney should technically be even higher on the list. Undisputed at 135, 2-division champion, but Haney had maybe the easiest path to undisputed of all time. George Kambosos is a very easy fighter to win 3 belts from. But at the same time, I think Devin Haney's skills definitely go underrated. I think in terms of its snappiness, Devin Haney has the best jab in boxing. He's very, very light on his feet, and the simple combination of those two makes him a really, really good boxer. If he can dictate the range like that, he doesn't really need power or a chin. And I think there's definitely a path to victory for him beating everyone at 140. I think Austrian or not, if Devin Haney kept his right glove up when fighting Ryan Garcia, he would have won every single round. It's just the simple mistake of him dropping his glove that led to the fight ending the way it did. Either way, Haney's on the list on pure talent, accomplishments and potential. I'm also just saying in terms of Ryan Garcia, Devin Haney would not lose to Rolly Romero. Now to number 14, we have Teofimo Lopez. Now again, this is a very controversial and difficult one. Teo has one of the best wins in recent boxing memory versus Vasily Lomachenko, had a great win upper weight class versus undisputed champion Josh Taylor, and most recently looks improved versus Arnold Barboza Jr. with his newfound use of the jab. Those wins in isolation could maybe put Teo top 5 pound for pound. But the thing is the shaky performances in between. I think you can argue he did lose to Sandor Martin and Jermaine Ortiz, and he did lose to George Kambosos Jr., maybe the worst unified champion in boxing history. Considering though the way Teo fought on that night, I think it's a massive off night. He was also dealing with something like an inflamed lung at the same time. But there's no excuses for the Sandor Martin or Jermaine Ortiz fights though. I think those are simply bad matchups for him. But judging from the Barboza fight, Teo's gotten a bit better at cutting off the ring, and we may start to see the greatness in Teo that he was expected to have if he continues to learn and improve. Now moving down to number 13, we have Gervonta Tank Davis. Tank, Teo and Haney are three of the most controversial boxers in the world at the moment. There's reason to believe all three are overrated or underrated. Haney lost to Ryan, Teo lost to Cambosos, Tank maybe should have lost to Lamont Roach. I think out of the three, who's the most consistent and who passes the eye test the best? I think it is Tank Davis. But Tank has also taken the least amount of risks out of the three. But at the same time, again, I think even if Ryan was on Osterine for the Tank Davis fight, I think it still plays out the same way. I don't think it's a coincidence that Ryan Garcia loses to two hard-hitting southpaws who keep their right gloves up, and Devin Haney, who doesn't keep his right glove up, ends up losing. I also think Tank's draw with Lamont Roach isn't as bad of a look as Teo's loss to Cambosos or Jermaine Ortiz or Sandor Martin. Not to mention, I would also pick Tank over Teo and Haney. I think Jojo Diaz laid a pretty good blueprint on how to beat Devin Haney, and I think a counterpuncher like Tank is a nightmare for teofimo Lopez. I think Tank is good, but I've also never actually put him inside the top 10 in my pound for pound list, even before the Roach fight. People putting him in their top 5s does baffle me a little bit, considering how much his resume is lacking. I made a whole video about his resume, I recommend checking it out. Either way, I think 13 is where I'd put Tank Davis. Now to number 12, we have Canelo Alvarez. Canelo has definitely dropped off quite a bit in recent years. I think back in the end of 2021, you have to have him at least top 5 pound for pound. After the Caleb Plant win, he was a 4-division champion, undisputed at 168. I don't think he took too much of a loss pound for pound after losing to Bivol. Bivol was a weight class bigger after all. But what we've seen since Bivol is not only a decline in opposition, but a decline in performance from Canelo. I don't think we'll ever see the quality that Canelo showed versus Billy Joe Saunders back in 2021. The counter-punching, the aggression, the shot selection was on point that day. Since then, we've more or less just seen him load up on power punches. There's no real setup, and as a result, he's not got a KO in 4 years. Pound for pound does take into consideration who you beat, and if you're beating Edgar Berlanga, Jaime Munguia, William Skull, it's not quite the same as Inoue's recent wins over Stephen Fulton and Marlon Tapales, Crawford's wins over Spence and Madrimov, Usyk's wins over Fury and Dubois, and I thought the Skull fight was actually quite close. And for that reason especially, Canelo is outside the top 10. Moving on to number 11, we have Jai Opetaia. Jai Opetaia's run before and after winning the title has been great to watch. He was thrown straight into the deep end in his first ever 12-rounder versus Maris Bridis, the world champion. I can't understate how much of a nightmare Maris Bridis is as a first step-up opponent, and Opetaia pulled through to win the title. Since then, he's just been knocking out contender after contender. In devastating fashion, he's one of the best athletes in boxing. Murderous power, fast hands, fast feet, Samoan chin. His defense isn't that good, and he does have a tendency to slow down, but I think his offense makes up for it sometimes. Opetaia is now set to face Claudio Squayo. Opetaia might knock him out by accident, and for all those reasons, he's at number 11. Now finally entering the top 10, we have Oscar Collazo. Collazo is one of the most dominant minimum weights in a long time. The performances he's been putting on and the dominance in these fights is rarely seen in a division that mostly has competitive fights where the belts change hands all the time. I see Collazo as a little 105-pound Puerto Rican Lomachenko. He's got such good footwork, counter-punching ability, his technique is so clean, he's powerful. His little slips, rolls and side steps are really impressive parts of his defence. He made Melvin Jerusalem, fellow champion who's also on this list, quit on the stool, and in his most recent fight completely shut out and knocked out Thamanoon Neomtrong, who'd been a champion for 8 years. Collazo is extremely underrated and deserves a spot in the top 10. Next up at number 9, we have Artur Beterbiev. Beterbiev is a hard one to place because I think at this point, especially after his most recent fight, we can safely say he's slowing down. I don't think we've actually seen Beterbiev gas in a fight until the rematch with Bivol. That may be attributed to the pace that Beterbiev put on in the first half of the fight. Either way though, you can't expect improvement from Beterbiev from this point onwards. But as it is right now, he still deserves a spot in the top 10. Not only did he beat Bivol the first time, the second time that was Bivol's hardest fought win by far, including guys like Canelo and Zerdo, who are also quite high on the list. Beterbiev is great and firmly number 2 at light heavyweight. Moving on to number 8, we have Kenshiro Taraji. Taraji's been picking up such an impressive resume in the past several years. He's got either the second best or the best jab in boxing. He's now a 2-division champion, wins over Pedro Guevara, Masamichi Yabuki, Hiroto Kiguchi, Anthony Olasquaga, Heki Budler, Carlos Canizales, Sega Yuriakui. 4 of those names are also in this video, especially Canizales and Yabuki. He recently unified the titles by knocking out Sega Yuriakui, and he may be set for a rematch with Olasquaga or Yabuki. He's a very, very good boxer, and he deserves all the respect, especially for the amount of times he fights each year. Moving up to number 7, we have Junto Nakatani. Junto has done similar to what Taraji's done, but in much more dominant fashion. He's one of the hardest punchers in the lower divisions. He's a 3-division champion. He's not even had a close fight in his career so far, and his great wins date all the way back to 2016 when he beat Masamichi Yabuki, then 2017 when he beat Sega Yuriakui. Granted, that's when they were all on the domestic scene. Fast forward to him beating Francisco Rodriguez Jr., Argy Cortez, Andrew Maloney, Alejandro Santiago. He's now set to face Ryosuke Nishida. I actually think that's a very tough fight and the toughest fight of Junto's career so far. It's a close one to call, but naturally you do have to lean Junto. Not to mention, Junto seems to get more powerful the more he moves up. Santiago had never been knocked down, let alone knocked out, prior to his fight with Junto. So Junto deserves his spot at number 7. Now to number 6, we have Shakur Stevenson. I really do see Shakur as the most talented out of that batch of 135 to 140 pounders. Teofimo, Lopez, Devin, Haney, Tank Davis, Ryan Garcia. I think Shakur just shows far better overall boxing ability compared to those guys. Keyshawn's getting close to Shakur, but he needs some more wins in first. Shakur has the best amateur background out of them. Statistically, he's got the best defense in boxing. In terms of how many punches thrown at him actually land, he's a 3-division champion. Tank, Haney and Teo are only 2 divisions. The numbers quite simply do not lie. The only valid criticism you can have against Shakur is that he's boring, but that's got no bearing on his boxing ability. Shakur is set to face William Zepeda next, and I think he stops William Zepeda, and I think all that puts Shakur at number 6. Finally, making our way to the top 5, we have Jesse Bam Rodriguez. Once we get to this part of the video, pretty much all these fighters are multi-division, multi-weight world champions unified, and it does become difficult to separate them, and largely it does come down to personal preference. If this was purely based on form and potential, Jesse Rodriguez would be number 1. The run that Jesse Rodriguez has been on in recent years is incredible. Beating Quadras, stopping Rung Visai, stopping Estrada, stopping Sonny Edwards, stopping Pedro Guevara, and especially in the way that he's beating these fighters. A lot of these wins are complete shutout and knockout victories, especially his most recent versus Guevara, who's very decent by the way. Guevara was a former champion who'd never been stopped, went to close decisions versus Jonril Casimero and Kenshiro Taraji quite a long time ago, but Guevara was still in decent form, and Rodriguez barely even took a punch in that fight. Bam is about to add another champion to his resume, Fumalele Cafu, and that's a fight he's certain to win. Next up at number 4, we have Dimitri Bivol. Bivol was the best defensive boxer in the sport statistically, until the 2 Better Beer fights which ruined it, so now it's Shakur Stevenson. Bivol though to this day I think has the most impressive tight guard I've ever seen in boxing. I've never seen someone who's that difficult to hit without actually moving away too much, and I'm including all of boxing history on that list. It's very difficult to think of any other contenders besides Mayweather, but even then he was moving quite a lot. Bivol in general is just a really impressive boxer to watch. The footwork, the jab, the adjustments, the game plan, the defense, the combinations. He's not a flashy boxer by any means. He's just a really, really good boxer, and that's entertaining to watch. He's got maybe the strongest top 3 names on his resume out of anyone in boxing. Zerdo, Canelo and Beterbiev. All 3 of those wins being quite convincing as well. There's not too much depth outside of that. And what also holds Bivol back on this list is that Bivol has only ever fought in 1 division. The people we're going to get into have fought people at least 20 pounds bigger than their opponents when they first started boxing. So that's not really a blip on Bivol's record, it's more so there are people who've done more than he has. And that's what puts Bivol at number 4. Moving on to the top 3, where we're going to start talking about Terence Crawford. The top 3 is where the ridiculous accomplishments start to come in, and it also becomes difficult to split the fighters. Crawford is a 4-division champion, 2 times undisputed. People like to poke holes in his resume, but Yuriorkis Gamboa, Victor Postol, Jose Benavidez Jr., Kavaliauskas, Kell Brook, Sean Porter, Errol Spence Jr., Israel Madrimov, those are good wins on a guy's record. It took him until he was 36 years old in his 4th weight class to have his first ever competitive fight versus Israel Madrimov. Madrimov being a very tricky fighter, not just physically, but stylistically as well. Crawford is one of, if not the best counterpuncher in boxing history. There's such a short window of time in his fights where his opponent's fine, and then suddenly he's not. We saw versus Sean Porter, as soon as Crawford learned that he was maybe down on the scorecards, Crawford immediately dropped him 10 seconds into the round. Crawford is different gravy, and I'm starting to feel that he's going to beat Canelo. The only reason the other two are above him is because I think they have slightly better names on their records. Besides that though, it's like splitting hairs. If Crawford beats Canelo, he's number one, no question. Next up at number 2, we have Alexander Usyk. The reason I have Usyk above Crawford and Bivol is simply because I think the jump between cruiserweight and heavyweight is the hardest jump you can make in boxing. Because heavyweight does not have a limit, the difference in the size and physicality of the fighters you run into after a single weight jump is far more significant than, for example, 135 to 140. Even if Terence Crawford completely skipped 140 and 147 and immediately jumped up to 154 in 2015 to face a guy like Erislandy Lara, I still don't think the size difference would be as drastic as when Usyk fought Fury. If you remember the narrative before Usyk fought Fury and Joshua, it was that even if Usyk is a better boxer, Joshua and Fury are simply too big to lose. As it turned out, Joshua and Fury were clearly too big for Usyk, and Usyk won anyway. Even ignoring the size difference, Usyk's got one of the best resumes in boxing. Krzysztof Kowalski, Maris Briedis, Michael Hunter, Murat Gassiev, Derek Chisora, Anthony Joshua twice, Tyson Fury twice, Daniel Dubois, about to be Daniel Dubois twice. Usyk is a great representative of the sport. He's got a really strong case to be number one. It's just that I really think there's one boxer who's a bit better than him. Leave a like, subscribe and leave a comment if you can guess who it is. The number one best boxer in the world is Deji Olatunji. Deji has maybe the best resume in boxing history. I'm joking. Number one is going to go to Naoya Inoue. To run through Naoya's achievements, he started at 108 pounds. He's fought in 5 weight divisions, now being at 122. He won titles in all of those divisions except 112. Went undisputed at 118 and 122. He's got a great resume, wins over the likes of Ryocha Taguchi, Adrian Hernandez, Omar Narvaez, Jamie McDonnell, Emmanuel Rodriguez, Nonito Donaire twice, Jason Maloney, Stephen Fulton, Marlon Tapales, Luis Neri. What puts him above Crawford and Usyk is the dominance of his fights, in my opinion, and also the form that he's on, because Crawford and Usyk are getting there in age. They're on the verge of retirement at this point. Inoue to this day has still not had a close fight. You could argue Usyk's fight versus Maris Briedis could be a draw. You could argue Terence Crawford's fight versus Israel Madrimov could be a draw. Inoue's closest fight was the first fight versus Donaire, and even then I think Donaire won about 4 rounds at most, including a knockdown for Inoue. Not to mention Inoue has knocked out 11 opponents in a row. I'm going to rip a segment from my previous Inoue video to look at the numbers. He's fought in 23 world title fights, won 10 world titles, beat 11 champions, 7 of which were champions at the time of the fight in the same division. One interesting stat that I found is that he's got the highest round winning rate out of all the current champions in boxing, meaning that out of all the rounds that are recorded on BoxRec in his career, according to the majority of judges, he's only lost 14 rounds, meaning that he wins 92% of rounds in his career. For comparison, Terence Crawford's is 84% and Usyk's is 74%. So by the numbers, Inoue is the most dominant champion in boxing. It's also important to mention how many names Inoue should have on his record, but doesn't because of boxing reasons. Several champions on Inoue's way up, particularly in 112 and 115, avoided the Inoue fight in some way, including Chocolatito, Donny Nietes, Kala Defy and Casemiro. There's even more than this, and it's complicated to get into the reasons why. Another interesting stat that I've found is that Inoue has never been outlanded in any way, in any category, according to CompuBox stats. And I don't just mean he's never been outlanded in general, I mean he's never been outlanded in any category. So no one's landed more body shots, jabs, power punches, anything on Inoue. The closest it ever came was versus Donaire in the first fight, where they were tied 51-51 on body shots. For comparison, guys like Crawford and Usyk have been out jabbed or out power punched before. Canelo's been out punched in general several times. So outside of his resume, Inoue by numbers is the best boxer in the world. So for that reason, I do think Inoue is the best boxer in the world. And that does it for the longest video I've ever made. If you've made it this far without skipping, well done. I know this list is a bit of a mess, there's some placements I disagree with already. Like Alberto Puello shouldn't be that high. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you've made it this far, like and subscribe. Leave a comment, you know the deal. This video took so fucking long to figure out, I swear to God. Goodbye.